Hi, welcome to the domain 12 of CCSK. This domain is focused on identity entitlement and access management. There are three questions which we can expect in the exam from this domain. This video is certainly going to help you in preparation of the exam in lesser effort and time. Watch till the end to avoid any misconception or confusion. If you are watching my videos for the first time, please subscribe to the channel for regular videos updates. Identity access management, it is deeply impacted by the cloud computing in both private and public cloud. Two parties are required to manage IAM without compromising the security. Issues are more or less same, what we have in traditional IT, but those issues are now bigger in the cloud. There are no new issues, I would say, but the similar issues, but those issues become now bigger in terms of the cloud. Also, in the cloud computing, the fundamental problem is that the multiple organizations are now managing the identity and access management to the resources, which can greatly complicate the process. For example, imagine having to provision the same user on dozens or the hundreds or of different cloud services. You have different organizations involved in a cloud, and if every organization is coming up with their own authentication solution or even the different authentication solution, then it is going to be more complicated and very difficult to manage. That is where the federated identity helps to manage with this problem. We will talk about it later in the next slides. Common IAM terms. IAM is identity, access, and management. Entity is the person or the thing that will have an identity. It could be any individual, a system, a device, or the application code. Whereas the identity, um, in terms of uh, the unique expression of the entity within a given namespace. An entity can have multiple digital identities, such as the single individual having a work identity, or even multiple identities depending on the system. A social media identity and a personal identity, for example, if you are a single entry in a single directory server, then that is your identity. Identifier, this means by which an identity can be asserted. For digital identities, this is often a cryptological token, which is known as the identifier. In the real world, you can compare it with the passport as an identifier. Attributes, facet of an identity. Attributes can be relatively static, like an organization unit, or highly dynamic, like IP address, device being used. If the user authenticated with the multi-factor authentication or the location, um, we can say attributes like if you are allowed to log in to a particular site from a particular place or at a particular time, then it is the attribute to that authentication. Persona, the expression of an identity with the attributes that indicates the context. For example, a developer who logs into to work and then connect to a cloud environment as a developer on the particular project. Role, identities can have the multiple roles, which indicates the context. Role is confusing and abused term, used in many different ways. For our purpose, we will think of it as similar to the persona or as a subset of persona. For example, a given developer on a given project may have different roles, such as super admin and dev, which are then used to make access decisions. Authentication is the process of confirming an identity. When you log in into the system, you present the username, password, and then you will refer to the authentication factor that is known as the authentication process. Multi-factor authentication, use of the multiple factors in the authentication. Common options including the one-time passwords generated by the physical or the virtual device tokens, out-of-band validation through and OTP sent via text or something like that. So we will talk about the multi-factor authentications in this session later. Access control, restricting the access to a resource. Access management is the process of managing the access to that resource. Authorization, allowing an identity to access something he or she is supposed to access. That is the authorization. Entitlement is a mapping or a matrix we create that who can access what. Federated identity management, the process of asserting an identity across the different systems or the organizations. This is the key enabler of the single sign-on. Authoritative, the source, the root source of the identity, such as a directory server that manages the employee identities. Identity provider, the source of the identity in the federation, who is going to provide the identity. Relying party, who is going to rely on that identity, which is provided by the identity provider. There are different standards here for the cloud computing, like SAML, we have OAuth, OpenID, and XSEML and SCIM. So when we talk about the SAML, especially SAML 2.0, it is an OSIS standard for the federated identity management that supports both authorization and the authentication. So this point is very important, and you may see the questions around that. That what the SAML 2.0 supports. So it is the authentication and authorization. It uses the XML to make assertion between the identity provider and relying party. Assertions can contain the authentication statements, attribute statements, and the authorization decision statements. SAML is very widely supported by both enterprise tools and the cloud providers, but can be complex to initially configure. OAuth is the standard for the authorization that is widely used for the web services. OAuth is designed to work over HTTP. This is very good point to remember, and is currently on a version 2.0, which is not compatible with version 1.0. To add a little confusion to the mix, OAuth 2.0 is more of a framework and less rigid than OAuth 1.0, which means implementation may not be compatible. It means most often used for delegating access control and authorization between the services. OpenID is a standard for federated authentication that is very widely supported for the web services. It is also based on the HTTP with URLs used to identify the identity provider and the user's identity. The current version is OpenID Connect 1.0, and it is very commonly seen in the consumer services. There are two other standards, XACML and SCIM. So XACML is a standard for defining the attribute-based access control and authorization. It is a policy language for defining the access control at the policy decision point and then passing them to the policy enforcement point. So it is a kind of access control list which is defined at the policy decision point and then passed on to the policy enforcement point. So that the two different point, one is deciding the policy and another is enforcing the policy. Also, it can be used with both SAML as well as OAuth, since it solves a different part of the problem, like deciding what an entity is allowed to do with the set of attributes as opposed to handling the login or the delegation of authority. SCIM is another standard for exchanging the identity information between the domains. It can be used between provisioning or deprovisioning accounts in the external system and for exchanging the attribute information. So here, this is the federated identity. So there are three different entities here. One is the user, of course, who wants to access the service. and this user is going to access this relying party or any service from this relying party. So it will submit the OpenID URL, and then this relying party and identity provider will exchange some the secrets to establish the identity for this user, and then the browser will redirect to get token from the provider. Then the provider to request this IP for the token for the site, and it will log in if needed to the identity provider for the credentials provided by the provider, and then the token returns to the user, and the same token will be handed over to the relying party. So this relying party trusts this identity provider and will start trusting this user as well, based on this token which is passed on in the seventh step. So this is how the federated identity works here in the cloud, and this is very important topic to avoid or to overcome the problems of having with this single sign-on or with the thousands of the different services which are integrated in the cloud. Managing users and identities. So here the managing identities and federation architecture, it is in the in the cloud, the provider and the cloud user need to start with the fundamental decisions on how to make the or to how to manage the identities. Like cloud provider need to nearly always support the internal identities, identifiers and attributes for the users who directly access the services, while also supporting the federation so that the organization don't have to manually provision and manage every user in the provider system, and issue everyone a separate credential. Also, the cloud user need to decide where they want to manage their identities and which architectural model and technology they want to support to integrate with the cloud providers. So there are two types of architecture here in the federated architecture. One is the hub and the spock. So in this, we have uh, the hub and spock. We have a central broker proxy. Like if we draw like this is the uh, central broker. Okay, and these are the different service providers here at this layer, and here we will have the identity provider. So this is the identity providers area, and this is the broker, and we have the service providers here. So this is hub and spoke. We have another federation architecture where we have like free form. So in free form, we have different service providers, and these service providers without any broker, they are talking to each other freely. So that is why this is known as the free form model. So in free form model, internal identities, providers, sources connect directly to the cloud, while in the hub and spock, the internal identity provider communicate with the central broker or repository, then serves as the identity provider for the federation. So this is the uh, so this is known as the free form. Okay, So that is the architectures. There are two main architectures in the federation. There are few issues with them, though. The directory needs internet access. This can be a problem depending on the existing topology or any or it may violate the security policy. It may require user to VPN back to the connect corporate network before accessing the cloud services. um, Also, depending on the existing directory servers, or especially if you have multiple directory servers in the different organization silos, federation to the external provider may be complex, or we can say that technically difficult. Authentication and credentials. So we have different authentication and credentials here. The authentication is the process of proving or confirming an identity. In the information security, authentication most commonly refers to the act of the user logging in, but it also refers to the essential um, time of an entity that proves who they are and assume an identity. Authentication is the responsibility of the identity provider. So, why do we need the strong authentication, especially in the cloud? So, there are two main reasons here. One is the broad network access, and another is the single sign on. Because single sign on will compromise the large number of services if because single sign on is the one time. If you have access to one, then you can access all. Broad network access, because everything on the network, and losing credentials will lead to the account takeover by an attacker, not restricted to a particular network. So that is the reason we need the multi-factor authentication. That is considered as the as the strongest option. There are multiple options for the multi-factor authentication. As we can see here, the hard tokens, these are physical devices that generate the one-time password for human entry or need to be plugged in into a reader. These are the best option when the highest level of security is required. Soft tokens work similarly to the hard tokens, but are software applications that runs on a phone or computer. Software tokens are also an excellent option, but could be compromised if the user's device is compromised. And this risk need to be considered in any threat modeling when you perform the threat modeling. Out of band passwords, these are the text or the other messages sent to the user's phone, and then entered like any other one-time password generated by the token. So why it is called as out of band? Because you enter the password, you enter your credentials first. So the same band is not going to be used here. Okay, it is the different band which is different route which is going to be used. For example, this is the user who is accessing this computer. Okay, and just enter the credentials here. Okay, but then when there is one out of band password which is sent, so this service will send this password to this user through the cellular. Okay, through the cellular, not through the same route. So that is why it is known as the out of band. uh, Biometrics. Biometrics are the very good options. Again, it is tied with the human presence. For the cloud service especially, the biometric is a local protection that doesn't send the biometric information to the cloud provider, and is instead an attribute that can be sent to the provider, such as the security and ownership of the local device need to be considered. Entitlement and access management. Different things here. One is the authorization, who can access what. For example, here, the user one can access um, two machines or two assets. One is the asset one, another asset two, asset three, while user two can access asset two and asset three. This is the authorization. Okay, once the user one is successfully authenticated, then he will be authorized to access asset one and asset three. So it talks about the permission to do something, access a file or the network, or perform a certain functions like an API call on the particular resource. While the access control that defines that you can access asset one, asset two, asset three. So this is like the access control. So what is denied, what is permitted? This says, for example, you can access asset one, you can access three, asset three, but you cannot access asset two. So this is the access control. Entitlement, it is like you have user one, user two, user three, and then you have assets in the list. Okay, then for example, you have three assets like A1, A2, A3. So what user one can access? User one can access asset one and asset three. So this is not user 2 can access asset 2 and asset 3. Asset 1 cannot be accessed. Similarly, on user 3, it can access only asset 2. So this is the entitlement matrix. Okay, so time for questions. A federation is standard based on HTTP using URLs to provide identity assertion. So here, this describes the Open ID Connect. This doesn't describe SOAP. This doesn't describe TCP/IP. This doesn't describe Prime Directive. This is the um, distraction here. So correct answer is A. The process mechanism used to confirm that an identity assertion belongs to the entity presenting it. So what is it? It talks about the confirmation. So one is the confirmation, that is the point to consider, and the identity assertion, and that belongs to the entity that is presenting. So who is confirming that? And somebody is confirming that this identity assertion belongs to the entity presenting it. That means it is authenticating somebody. Okay, a tool used to map out access controls, access rights, and the permissions against the authenticated identity assertions and the characteristics. So we just discussed that if we have the rights permissions in the table against a particular asset to the users, then this is an entitlement matrix. Sometimes we call it as the ACL, access control list. So who remains responsible for enforcing the access control and authorization? So there are two things here. One is who defines, so whose responsibility is to define the who needs access to what. Another is the enforcement. So defining, because the cloud provider is not the owner of that particular service or information. Ownership remains with the customer. So customer remains responsible to define that. This is the customer, uh, but who enforce those policies, those controls and authorizations? It is the responsibility of the provider. Okay, so when you see the question of enforcement, the cloud provider is the right answer. When you see the defining the access control or authorization, the cloud customer is the right answer. Okay, with this we conclude the CCSK Domain 12, Identity Entitlement and Access Management. Thanks for watching the full video. I hope you like the video. Please subscribe, like, comment, and share in your network. Thank you.